All right, it's my pleasure to have with me today Brett Polegato, a dear friend, a wonderful colleague, an incredible artist, an international baritone who sang in the major opera houses in the world, La Scala di Milano, the Metropolitan Opera, the Teatro Colón of Buenos Aires, as well as a soloist with major international orchestras. Brett is also the recipient of, I believe, 3 Grammy Awards. So a real treat to have you with me and to be able to ask you a few questions today. How are you doing, Brett?
I'm doing well. I'm here in Toronto and we don't have snow and it's the middle of January, so that's a pretty good thing.
Unusual, huh?
And not so unusual, but to have had I think we've had maybe 2 days of snow all winter, so that's slightly unusual.
Wow. I
Yeah.
used to live in Buffalo, just across the border, and I remember by this time it was pretty much solid snow.
It's very different because of the lake. We call it the lake effect. The winds, I grew up in Niagara Falls. The winds tend to go between Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. So Niagara Falls, Buffalo gets pummeled. But because we're on the north shore of Lake Ontario, all of the weather goes south of us. So it's rare for us to get huge amounts of snow in Toronto. It gets cold, but yeah, not like Buffalo or some of those in New York cities.
All the Southerners, as you might call them. What a lovely city Toronto is. Anyhow, but I'm gonna break the ice by asking you a very, very general question. Then we're gonna go into more specific areas. But let me start by asking you, why is opera important to you? What is relevant about opera, about this art form in our contemporary world?
I think what I like most about opera is that, of course, there's always a storyline, but it deals primarily with emotions. And right now, I think everyone's emotions are going through the ringer a little bit. Um, I think almost every emotion one feels has been dealt with in some opera or the other. And the other great thing, not only are emotions dealt with on an intellectual, verbal level, but emotions are dealt with on a musical level that kind of bypasses intellect. So if you're not an intellectual person, or even if you are an intellectual person, sometimes music can elicit a response that gets to the root of the problem or addresses the root. Uh, it feels like someone's talking to you, even if they're not saying anything. Opera functions on so many layers: the musical, dramatic, verbal, instrumental, and I think it's a very broad way for people to find help with emotional crises in their lives.
Wow. So essentially, the complexities of all the different layers, how it can speak in simple terms to somebody who's got no opera background even, or how those complexities can get layered vastly for somebody who's got plenty of experience. Or
And I also think that it's not a subtle art form in some ways, that emotion happens on a grand scale. And, it's like going to the gym. Better to sweat a lot than to sweat a little. When you sweat a little, it's kind of uncomfortable. But when you sweat a lot, it's cathartic. And I think the same thing with opera. The emotions are so grand that you're experiencing them on a wave. And so you completely experience them. They're not, while they can be complex emotions, they're amplified so that really they can really wash over you and have a profound effect.
I always love thinking of the analogy of a wonderful work of art, a statue, and when you look at them, depending on the perspective, the David. If you're from underneath, it's so huge and the proportions look incredible. But if you look at it actually from the height, it will look like the head is way too big and things are. It's a little bit. You have to exaggerate some things so that it looks. It speaks more directly to
Yeah.
whoever is in a different vintage point, right?
Right. And another aspect, which doesn't necessarily apply to opera, but there's something quite fascinating about experiencing something personally, a work of art, in public, because I can be sitting right next to someone who is having a completely different emotional experience to the Statue of David or Tosca. We're all in the same room, so it's an individual experience, not shared publicly, but being experienced publicly. The person may not know what I'm going through, but I'm aware of the fact that there are people around me while I'm feeling these emotions, and there aren't that many times in our lives where that's possible. Funerals, any sort of mass gatherings, perhaps when the emotions are high, weddings. But by and large, we experience life solitarily or with crowds passing, not actually experiencing the exact same thing, which is also what's interesting about the pandemic. It's the first time, certainly in my lifetime, where we're all experiencing the same trauma. I'm sure in your life you've had someone who has been sick or someone who's just had a baby, but those are unique to you and your family. So if I'm rehearsing with you, for me, it's just another rehearsal day, but your sister or your cousin may have just given birth. So I don't experience what you're experiencing on that day. But in the pandemic, I know there are degrees of the pandemic, but we're all experiencing and processing the same trauma at the same time. So I'm very aware that my neighbor is going through what I'm going through right now. And that is a similar experience to what happens in the performing arts. I'm very aware that my neighbor is also watching what I'm watching and probably experiencing it. So I think during the pandemic, I think art will help us deal with this idea of all experiencing something at the same time and taking different things away, and hopefully making us more empathetic people at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you, that whether this is a situation of peer pressure, I have to cry because this is the moving part and the guy sitting next there is crying, or peer relief, kind of feeling the empathy of, we're all going through this together, what moving music, and everybody reacts however they can.
But even, as you say, even the thinking of, oh, the guy next to me is crying, should I cry too, makes you aware of why you do things. What am I feeling? Why am I not feeling? Why is he crying? What is it? Why don't I feel that way? It makes us more empathetic people to examine, to be able to see the reactions of other people.
Wow. Beautiful. So let me ask you now, you've sung many major roles in a variety of repertoire, from Britten, Wagner, Debussy, Mozart, Puccini, Verdi, Rossini, Monteverdi. You've done it all. And you've also worked with contemporary composers. In fact, that's how we met. I was so lucky. This is 6.5 years ago, I believe, 2014.
Oh my gosh, yes.
We performed together at the Teatro Colón in Buenos Aires. We were doing the world premiere of an opera by Oscar Strasnoy. And we've remained good friends since then. So your wealth of variety is incredible, and how you're so incredibly flexible as an artist. But what are some of these roles that you treasure so much, or the experience of creating something new? What could you recall in a pinch?
Well, I'm lucky, I think, because I didn't grow up with any classical music in my life. It's not quite true, but my experience, or my perception, was that there was no classical music in my life. It turns out actually my godparents played classical music all the time. I don't remember that. But so for me, anything that I do is pretty much a creation, because I really don't know the traditions. So I've considered myself quite fortunate that way, that I rarely come to something with preconceived notions. I don't know if it's because I like the underdog, but I tend to gravitate to roles that people say, oh, I hate that role, or I don't like that person. Or, so for instance, one of my favorite roles, which I could probably sing forever, is Onegin. I just find him such an incredibly deep, complex, I won't even say challenging, because there's a lot about him that I relate to. Same thing, as much as I find the role frustrating, dramatically, not musically, Sharpless is a character I find incredibly fascinating. He's in such difficult situation, and also we never really learn much about him. He doesn't really talk a lot about himself. So you have to the only clues we're given of his personality is in the things that he says to other people about their situation, the advice he gives Butterfly, the things he says to Pinkerton, and I find that fascinating. Another role, which is much more obvious, Rodrigo and Don Carlo. I mean, for me, he's got it all. He's diplomatic. He's selfless in many ways. He gives his life for his friend. He gives his life for his country. He's fearless. He speaks up to the king. He's clearly trustworthy enough that even the queen confides in him. He stands up to Eboli. And he, in the auto da fe scene, he intercedes on behalf of his friend and the king to call an end to this horrible confrontation when Don Carlo pulls his sword on his father. So he's, once again, we don't really learn much about him. We only learn about him through his actions. But it makes me always wonder, well, what has happened to create this man of action? I don't know anything about him. I don't know if he's an orphan. I don't, there's so little. I know he's based on a real life person. In the opera, we don't know that. And I'm a big believer that, you can read, Marriage of Figaro. You can watch the film Dinner at 8 if you're doing the Bolcom opera. And all those things are great. But ultimately, the audience only gets what they see that night. So for me, I should only be building a character on what is in the opera as it's presented, not enriching it with the work that it came from is helpful, but it's no better than if I create my own backstory about what I think happened to the character, because we're not doing the book or the painting or the play. We're doing this opera, and this is what the composer wanted to let us know about. So that's really all that we can use, and the reactions of our colleagues. At Marriage of Figaro, I've sung the Count probably. The Count and Pelléas are probably the two things I've sung the most in my career, and in particular with the Count, I know it changes dramatically based on the Countess and the kinds of responses I get from her. If she's sexy and strong, then my character changes. And I've had this happen, if I'm working with a countess who decides to be cold and from the get-go is just going to punish the Count, then that gives me freedom to do other things. So yeah, I guess of course the music is great and it's great to sing great music. But usually arias are my least favorite part of an opera. I'm much more interested in the character development that happens on either side of arias, to be honest.
Wow, that's exactly what I was going to ask you next. How you build a character, how you develop your relationship with colleagues on stage, and how is your process? And I think you've already answered most of that. But if there's anything else you want to add, and how if you've had situations where you come with an approach and it changes as rehearsals start, I'm sure.
Well, there are two examples of that, and I won't name. Well, I was doing a production of Bohème, which was quite pared down. In the opening scene, we were in the garret, and there was a desk and a chair, a bed, like a single bed with two mattresses, a chaise longue. I don't know why it was in the room, and then instead of an easel, it turned the chair upside down, and the four legs. What do you call it? Rested the painting, I guess, on those four legs to work as an easel. So in Act 4, when we came back, the director had decided, that we've fallen on hard times, and now in the room there was just the chaise longue, and I forget. Oh, there was some of the chairs. So I said, okay, I don't understand. If we, as artists, have fallen on hard times, but the only thing that will allow us to get money is what we do. Why would we sell the desk that Rodolfo writes on? Why would we sell the bed that has two mattresses, which we could split? Why would we keep this divan? Like that, to me, seems character-wise the first thing that we'd sell, because it's the least useful to us. And I wasn't trying to be difficult, but And the director had no answer. The director said, well, I just thought, it would look better for Mimi to die on that because it has a higher back on it, which is dramatically not a really good reason. And then the director's assistant said, well, maybe the truth is, as characters, or as people, you are so tied to being bourgeois, and that the divan was the last sort of frivolous thing, and you still can't let go of the fact that you want to be rich, so that's why you kept that. And I said, okay, that I buy. And so without being difficult, it's really important to me that I understand the world that we're in, because then I make better choices. The flip side of that is I was doing a production of Marriage of Figaro, which I had done a million times. And the director, Stephen Lawless, had this production. And we're doing like the opening scene where the Count discovers Cherubino in the chair. So the line after that is Basilio intraccia tosto di Figaro volate, io voce veda. Basilio, go get Figaro, I want him to see. And normally, there's usually so much anger at seeing Cherubino there again in the middle of things that your line is fueled by anger. And Steve said, okay, that's really great, but what if you have enough time to process and go, okay, Susanna, I see you've been coy all this time saying that you're engaged to Figaro, but now I see Cherubino. So if you're willing to give it up for Cherubino, now I have proof that I can use against you, and you will give it up for me. So he said, what if it's more Basilio intraccia tosto di Figaro volate, io voce veda, just challenging Susanna, like drop the anger and go, okay, now I have an ace in my pocket. And I thought, gosh, I've done this 8 times and no one has ever said that to me. And that was the start of a really fabulous production. And Stephen and I have become very good friends because I felt that so much of what he was giving me wasn't necessarily a reinterpretation of the piece, but it was an emotional option that was new to me. And I'm the type of singer that if I'm going to do a character again, I want to find something new about them. So I think in general, for me, music is something that I don't go on autopilot for. So if it's an art song or an oratorio, I'm always trying to find out, like, what does this mean? What did the composer mean? What does it mean to me? What does it mean today in society? And so without trying to be difficult necessarily, I do want people to help me on that, to help me find what it is that I can bring to this. As a colleague of mine once said, I can't sell what I don't buy. Right? And there's truth. If I don't believe it, how can the audience ever believe it?
So I know you're an avid reader. We've talked about this before, but I'd like for people to know more about this. And can you share maybe what is the role of literature in your life? And I know it might actually affect the way you work as well.
People often ask me about music, how I became interested in music. And that's always a hard question for me to answer. But when it comes to literature, it's a very easy answer because I don't remember my life without books being involved. When I was very young, when I was first born, my mother still worked. So my godparents babysat me during the day while she was at work. And my godmother used to read to me every afternoon before nap. So I could read before I started kindergarten when I was 5. And just a sidebar, I really think that success in life so often depends on reading, because it's one of the skills that's important for everything. To be a good mathematician, you have to be able to read to understand how math works. If you want to be a scientist, you have to be able to read to understand formulas and theories. So I always felt, well poised because of reading to be able to absorb information, process it, and come up with my own thoughts about it. So and also because I read so early, I don't find literature daunting. I find it, like singing. I don't think about well, what note is that? What chord is that? You know, after a while, it becomes a tool that's second nature to you. I always read as a child, read as a teenager, got to university, and like so many people, there's so much reading for coursework that reading for pleasure kind of goes by the wayside. So it was only in my adult life when I started working professionally that reading really made a reappearance. And I guess as I've gone through difficult times in my life, reading has been a great solace to me. It's been something that I've turned to understand maybe the losses in, you know, personal losses that happen in life. In particular, poetry, to be honest. I credit the tragedies in my life as the thing that brought me closer to poetry. But I'm mainly a reader of fiction. And what I love about that, like most art, it creates an artificial environment in which the creator, in this case writers, can deal with certain emotions in a mock-up scenario. They can create the world in order to deal with the emotions of jealousy or hatred or betrayal or love, or and so I find that by experiencing the lives of others in literature, as an artist, I become much more aware of how differently people think, that my reaction to a certain situation isn't everyone's, and I try to keep those ideas in the back of my mind when I'm, you know, approaching opera, because you know, so often some of the most powerful characters in literature are the most enigmatic, the people who don't behave the way we think. And I find that fascinating, and I try to bring that to my art. Like it would, like as I was saying earlier with Stephen's example of Susanna and Count in The Marriage of Figaro, that sometimes your first instinct emotionally isn't the most interesting. And I think as artists it's important for us to, as you were saying earlier about making it contemporary, try to find contemporary reasons that even the composer may not have been aware of at the time. Last night on Facebook, I had a post about Anne Bronte, and a colleague of mine said, "Oh, those dreary women and those dreary books," and he started going off on Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights, how they're horrible. And I thought, it's one thing to not appreciate something, for it not to not resonate with you. But I think as artists, we do ourselves a great service if we only read and experience art that appeals to us. I think it's very, very important as artists to not immerse ourselves, but certainly experience things that we think is garbage or derivative or populist, because there's something in that will inform our art. And I really believe that as artists, our number one priority is to keep growing, is to keep experiencing, to keep absorbing.
So sometimes you probably find yourself forcing yourself to experience something that firsthand is not that appealing to you.
Well, I was saying this last night to another friend. I read the book American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis, which is so disturbing. And so, I mean, that man has a very twisted imagination. I probably threw the book on the ground about 10 times because I was so revolted by what I was reading, but I read it and it's one of the books that sticks most in my mind when it comes to making an impression, because it was so foreign to who I am and what I normally experience. And so I'm grateful that I read it. And there are other books too. Like, I'm not a big Ernest Hemingway fan. I remember reading Farewell to Arms, and I found his prose style very stilted for me. But that doesn't mean I wouldn't read him again. He's not my favorite author, but he's celebrated enough that there must be something that's worth examining to figure out, well, what does he accomplish that made him stand out?
That's a great point of view. So just a simple question, but very complicated answer, probably. Is there anything you'd like to change in the world of opera?
I wish, as I'm getting older, I would like, on a personal level, to be an advocate for younger singers, in this case, who may not have the ears of people higher up. I'd like to create a world that they can, feel that what they have to say has importance. I'm very thankful that I do so much art song, and for me, the big difference between art song and opera, for instance, is if you're going to see Marriage of Figaro, if someone is going to see Marriage of Figaro, they enter the theater saying, okay, I want Figaro to be a bass baritone. I want the Countess to be this kind of a soprano. The Count should be a lyric baritone with da-da-da-da. And so people arrive with so much baggage already on the piece. Whereas if I'm doing a recital and I'm singing Erlkönig, for instance, people go, oh, I wonder what he's going to say with it. Or and then on the next night, if a soprano does it, oh, I just heard a baritone sing that last night. I wonder what she will do. So I find that in the art song community, people are more interested in your personal expression about what it is. I don't want to use the word judgmental, but they're much more open to experiencing first and then deciding. I would like opera to have more of that. Of course, there are certain requirements for roles for sure, but I just wish that people wouldn't have a soundtrack already playing in their head before the singer that they're hearing that night is actually singing. To really sit back and go, did I like that? Did that move me? Don't say, well, when Caballé did that role, or when, Caruso sang that, this is what they did. I love that decrescendo, because that ultimately isn't really what the art form is about. So there's
tradition, right? That
yeah,
people expect you to follow a certain line.
and it's a very new tradition, in the sense that even in the time of Caruso, people weren't at home listening to recordings of Caruso. So, they would see La Bohème one night, and then 3 months later or whatever, they may have remembered what tenor A did, but they wouldn't have just played it on their, iPhone or iPad the night before. And we really need to get back to that ability to just allow the performers that night to do their job and decide then, what did I take away from it? So that's something I'd like to see happen in the art form. It feels like we're moving more and more, as the same in film, moving towards glamour casting. I don't know that that's ever going to change, because opera is such an expensive art form. But I know far too many incredibly talented singers who have retired far too early, because their career path just didn't happen to turn down the right street at some point. And we're not going to change every company out there, but I'm hoping that there will be more companies to offset that star casting, especially after the pandemic, when I know that money is going to be tight, and probably without a doubt, it's just going to be star casting after star casting, to the detriment of a lot of people who have trained long and hard and are still finding their way in this business. So I hope that we can resist, what I see as probably an inevitable consequence of the pandemic.
We'll go back to the pandemic in just a moment, but I love your idea of a more diverse, more inclusive type of casting. And the next question has to do with discrimination. And I wonder if in the workplace and working in different parts of the world, you've ever felt discriminated against because of your place of origin, religion, sexual identity, anything that you might have felt, hey, this shouldn't be happening.
Um, hmm. I've certainly experienced I've seen discrimination in other people for sure. Um, I'm rather in a unique minority group, because as a gay man, until I say something about being gay, no one really knows. So all I can say, and I won't say it's discrimination, I do know that primarily men in the business behave the conversations we have are very different before they find out that I'm gay to after. Is that discriminatory? I don't know that I certainly don't feel that I could certainly pinpoint a situation where there has been discrimination, but I know I've witnessed it with other colleagues. Actually, one experience in particular, this might not be necessarily in the workforce, but many years ago, when I was just a young singer, I was in Finland doing Silvio in Pagliacci, and the soprano was a Black American woman. And we were, after rehearsal, we were walking down the street, and she and I were talking, and all of a sudden she turned and yelled something on the other side of the street. And I said, what did you do that for? She said, didn't you hear them? And I said, no. She said, they just shouted white power as we walked by. And even now, I would probably have the same reaction. I just said to her, like, why would they do that? That's just stupid. So I'm very aware, you know, whether it's my colleagues who are minorities, the stories that I've heard from women about harassment in the business. I'm very aware that there is an undercurrent of behavior that, unless you fit one of the demographics, you wouldn't know about. I mean, as a gay man, I have been molested by people in the business when I was young. I never spoke of it certainly at the time, and I don't really speak about it now. So when I see straight colleagues, straight men, stand up for people in our business who have been accused of harassment, you know, when they say to me, well, I know that person and they would never do that, my response is always, to you. And we have to remember that the way people behave to us individually is not really indicative of their behavior. It's only indicative of their behavior to us. So I try to stay alert. I try to be an advocate for colleagues who may be discriminated against. And certainly I'll stand up when I openly see it in the workplace. You know, I will be an advocate for that person and say, look, I don't think that's appropriate. But it's by saying it's human nature, it kind of dismisses it. I think I think it's a part of human growth, individual growth, as Bill Maher said, that, you know, we have to distinguish between ignorance and willful ignorance. It's one thing to not understand what you're saying is wrong. It's another thing when you know it's wrong and you continue to do it. So I try to remember that too, that ignorance is very different from willful ignorance. And it's important when someone is being ignorant to maybe guide them along the right path. And when they're being willfully ignorant, to say, this is unacceptable.
Thank you for sharing that. So I want to ask you, I haven't asked anything of the sort yet. So maybe about your education, how you got started, and who were your most important, most inspiring mentors?
Well, as I said earlier, I've had so few, like I grew up with so few, so little classical background, but there are, you know, sort of signposts along the way. I can only guess this is what happened. I was in Sunday school as a kid, and someone must have said, oh, there's a kid in Sunday school who has a good voice, because I was approached by the church organist to join the junior choir, and then shortly after the senior choir, and I couldn't have been more than 7 or 8. So that was sort of my first introduction into music in general. And even then, I remember at that church, we were doing things like Vaughan Williams' Bury No Longer Toward Thine Heritage and the Vivaldi Gloria. So it was, you know, even for a small church in Niagara Falls, Ontario, I was exposed at a young age to to quite good classical music. In grade 7 and 8, I had a music teacher who was phenomenal, probably one of the biggest influences in my life. It was a separate school where 7 and 8 were together. And so every 2 years we would do a musical. And then in the between years, we would do a big Christmas concert. And I don't know, because she certainly didn't dumb down music. She was a firm believer in classical music and good music. But I remember the grade 7, we did Oklahoma. And I think there were about 200 people in the school, and 194 of them were involved. So there was the cast, there were 2 casts. And then instead of having the chorus on stage, there were bleachers lined up down the side of the gym. So there must have been about 80 people or 100 people in the chorus. And then there are people building sets. So, I look back, certainly for a small town like Niagara, but in general, to have 13 and 14-year-olds doing classical music and having 194 people out of 200 involved says something about the person whose passion is music. So she was, I don't know, it's funny because just by being passionate about it, not by being, she didn't dumb it down in any way. She didn't try to make it popular. I think her passion just resonated with so many of us at that age who were looking for people who were just passionate about anything. So she was the first person who suggested that I take singing lessons. And I remember thinking, because I was 13, if I can sing, why do I need lessons? Like the idea of it being a career was something new. So there was her. I had my first singing teacher, who I'm still very, very close friends with, when I was 16. And then there was another church organist who taught me piano, and in exchange I sang her choir to help prepare me for university. So those were the big influences preparing me for music. Of course, the people that I met at the University of Toronto were life-changing, because I'd never really sung in languages, a bit of French, a bit of German, but to hit university and be singing in Latin and Italian and German and all these other things was a real steep learning curve. I want to share one other story, though, that happened later on in life. So when I was 32 or so, my stepmother gave me my baby book, and underneath my baby book there was a package of pictures, and I was going through them, black and whites, from when I was a kid. And there was a picture of me at my godparents' house, and I'm sitting in my godfather's chair, and he had a table next to the chair, and on the table there were 3 albums. I remember the 2 I saw were Traviata, and the other one was Magic Flute. I don't know what the third one was. So as an adult, I often visited my godparents, and I talked to my godfather, and I said, I found this picture of me when as a child at your place, and there was Traviata and Magic Flute sitting next to your chair. And he said, I played opera all the time when you were a kid. So I like to tell the story because even to this day, I don't know what effect it had on me. I can honestly say, when I went on to study music, I never thought, this sounds familiar. So nothing stuck out so extremely that I even remembered any of that, but I can't help thinking that somehow that steeped in at some point. So
wow.
Anyway, yeah, it's an interesting story. It was kind of interesting to find out at 32 that part of your development that you didn't realize.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
So the next question has to do with you've worked all over the world with opera houses, orchestras, as a soloist in concert performances as well, art song, as you said. So you're very diverse in the type of work you do, and in the many different places you've done it. What are some of the fondest memories you have of any of your experience in your professional career?
Oh my gosh, that for me, that question is like, what is your fondest meals?
So hard.
It's so hard. As you said, I've been truly lucky. I think at last count, I've sung in 35 different countries, and I'm incredibly blessed because my career has always been evenly split between concert, recitals, and opera. So I've really sung everything. I would hate to have had to get rid of any of those categories. I love singing Bach. I love singing Wagner. I love Verdi. I love Debussy. I love Fauré. I love them all for very different reasons. So I would say that's one of the fondest memories, that I was lucky enough to have experienced such a wealth of music. And certainly as you get older, you look back and you are able to say, wow, I really have done a lot. Because at the time, I don't think it resonates with you just the significance of some of the things that you were lucky enough to do. I'm going to forget things for sure. One of my very early things was doing my La Scala debut in Peter Grimes with, I really, at that point, had only been singing for, like 7 years professionally. But the cast was Philip Langridge and Sarah Walker. The conductor was Jeffrey Tate, and the director, I don't know that he directed anything since then, was John Schlesinger, who directed Midnight Cowboy. So, to be at La Scala with these people was surreal in many ways. And to have been able to experience their art close up. I don't know. It's kind of a pinch me moment. Another concert that stands out in my mind, Marcello Viotti, conductor who's since passed away, had heard me in Leipzig doing Pelléas, and so he was doing a concert performance of Pelléas in Munich with the Bayerische Rundfunk Orchestra. So he said, would you come and sing Pelléas? So I said, sure. So this was, I'm trying to remember now, like 2002 or something. But I remember getting there. The Mélisande was Véronique Gens. The Golo was José Van Damme. Wow. At that point I had actually sung with him before, but still, it was José Van Damme. The Arkel, if you can believe it, was Nikolai Gyarov, who was 80 something. It was live to air, and Mirella Freni was in the audience that night. So, I know there are colleagues who do this on a regular basis and they take it for granted. But, I couldn't help thinking, here's this little boy from Niagara Falls who had no classical training in this situation. And it kind of made me, rather than feeling like a phony, it made me laugh, that you just think, when it comes down to it, no one cares musically, no one cares what your life story is. All they care about is what you say to them. And I think that's quite unique, that when I stepped on stage that night, no one in the audience knew my backstory. No one had any preconceived notions about me, and they didn't care. All they cared was, what is he going to bring to me, to the role of Pelléas, and how is it going to make me feel? And I think, there's that idea that we don't have to worry about what's brought us to this point, that just the fact that we're at this point allows us to say something. I have one other quick story, I hope, if you don't mind.
Oh, please.
A piece that I sing a lot, really more than anything else, is Messiah. I love singing Messiah because I understand that for a lot of people, it's one of the only classical things they experience every year, like Beethoven 9. But I also know that it's it's tied up with so much emotion. I remember Robert Shaw used to say to his choirs before they would go on stage to perform, remember, when we go out there tonight, there is somebody in the audience hearing this piece for the very first time, but there's also someone hearing this piece for the very last time. And I think about that in particular with Messiah. I look around the audience and I say, someone is not going to be here next year to hear this, and it's Christmas, and it's important for them. It's a message, regardless of your religious beliefs, it's a message that's important to them. So it's important to me because that's our job as an artist, is to hopefully bring hope to people. So this particular performance, one night, I got up to sing The Trumpet Shall Sound. And I stood up and said, behold, I tell you a mystery. And I looked in the audience, and about 4 rows back, there was an older woman and her daughter, who the daughter was probably my age. And the daughter put her arm around the woman. And I thought, oh, there's a story there. and I thought, I can't look at them. I mean, I'll sing for them, but I know that I couldn't look at them. So the performance ended. We got tremendous applause. We got flowers afterwards, and we went off before a second curtain call. And I said to the conductor, I don't mean to upstage the proceedings in any way, but do you mind if I give my flowers to these two ladies in the audience? And he said no. So I leaned forward and I gave them my flowers. And afterwards, they were waiting for me at the stage door. And the older woman said, I just wanted to thank you for tonight's performance. It was really special. I now live on the West Coast, and I'm back in Toronto visiting my daughter. I used to live here, and we would go, as she said, this is the first time I've been to Messiah in many years. And my daughter said, Mom, you really should come. So she said, years ago when we lived here, we would go to Messiah every year, my husband and I. And one year we were at Messiah, and after it finished, we were walking out of the theater, and I was talking to my husband, and then I realized he wasn't with me. So I turned around, and he was about 10 feet behind me on the ground. And I rushed over to him, and I said, don't move, I'll call an ambulance. And she said he was a cardiothoracic surgeon. And he said, there's not time.
Wow.
And she said that he died that night on the pavement. And she said, I've never been able to come to Messiah since then. And like, even years later, I can't tell that story without being affected by just how important music is. And, you know, that such a horrible memory has now hopefully been replaced by the fact that I was able to give her flowers. And without even knowing it, without even knowing what the story was, I could sense there was a story. And I can't help thinking that it was part of my journey, but it was also part of her journey. And, you know, I take away from that music so often accomplishes things that really have nothing to do with the piece itself, or even necessarily the message itself, although in this case, the trumpet shell sound certainly has resonance for someone who's lost a loved one. But, you know, it's just that whole communal thing that in a group of people, like we said earlier, we're all experiencing emotion, and being open to the signals of other people just helps us be more empathetic human beings. And I think with all the hatred that we see on social media these days, showing more empathy in the world is a really good thing.
What a beautiful, beautiful story. Thank you for sharing that. So we're approaching the end of the interview, and I have like a long question with a few questions inside it. Coming back to the pandemic, and I'd like to know what it is that you've been doing, what have been your main sources of inspiration during this time, and also perhaps if you want to share some advice for young musicians, whether aspiring opera singers or musicians in general, what it is that people could be doing during this time to find some solace and a way to continue getting better, which is what everybody needs.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I'm alone, so that already puts, you know, my situation is very different from other people who have families or who are couples. I really, although I enjoy being by myself and I've experienced no trouble, I can imagine that there are people out there that are really struggling. And I'm sure that one of our greatest challenges coming out of this pandemic is going to be mental health, which is another reason why I try my best to be even more empathetic these days, because I am sure that a lot of the responses that we encounter on social media and in real life, to be honest, are the result of people dealing with their struggles in their own way, including, you know, those horrible encounters in grocery stores with maskers or anti-maskers. I don't know. I would much rather find out what's going on there in their personal lives, and to make them respond that way rather than trying to teach them a lesson right now. You know, I think we just simply can't know the struggles that people are facing. Certainly in the musical community, as you know, I don't even want to think of the ramifications of, well, I haven't had a paycheck in 11 months, you know, so I can only imagine what that's like for people, and I have health care because I'm a Canadian. So I really, really, really try to be empathetic. As somebody who lives alone and doesn't have someone depending on me, I've spent a lot of time in the pandemic running errands for people, trying to say, look, I've got this free time on my hand. What can I do to maybe help someone's mental health or physical health, or, you know, or whatever. I've tried to be better with myself, tried to be patient with myself. I think there's a prevalent idea that one needs to get over things, that, you know, just you know, stop wallowing, stop feeling sorry for yourself. But I don't know that that's necessarily a healthy attitude. So throughout the pandemic, there have been days, you know, I've slept till 1 PM, and then I wake up and I stare at the ceiling. And rather than being hard on myself, what I've learned is, so often when I just say, you know what, just be like this today, and hopefully tomorrow you'll spring out of bed. And usually that's what happens. That to experience emotion, to go through it, rather than trying to negate it or worse, belittle it, I think is very good for us as human beings. I've been more aware of my moods, and also tried not to dismiss them. In terms of my own preparation, you know, I've been outside biking, and, you know, it's been, ironically, it's been weather-wise one of the most glorious summers we had this year, and even the winter's not been so bad. So, you know, had it not been for the pandemic, I think this would have been a stellar year for most people. But very, very early on in the pandemic, my voice teacher, who's in New York, said, you really need to be having a lesson every week. Now, even before the pandemic hit, because I travel so much, I would often have lessons online on Zoom or Skype or FaceTime. So that wasn't new to me. And I'm grateful that he insisted upon that very early on, because my advice to young singers, but people in general, none of us knows what's waiting for us on the other side of all of this. But in the case of singers, being out of shape vocally, I know, is not going to prepare us. So while I can't predict what is going to be required of me, I'm trying to have all of, you know, all of my ducks in a row, so that I have greater tools to draw on. And the second thing which has helped me a lot, a friend of mine says, and I don't know if you know this expression, I really didn't, they said not to borrow trouble. So, for instance, in September, Met canceled 2 of my contracts. So I knew that they were gone. Now I'm supposed to go to Bordeaux in May. So far, that's still there. So rather than worrying about, well, gee, what happens if Bordeaux cancels too, instead of borrowing trouble, focus on the things I know, which is the Met has canceled. I will not have work in those periods because those contracts are gone. I try to focus on what I know has happened and not what might happen. And I think that's really one of the only concrete tools we have right now, is focusing on what we know is reality, not what might become reality. I think we should plan for what might become reality, but I don't think it should allow us to become depressed or worried or stressed, or, you know, all those other things. You know, sort of live for the day, especially right now. Yeah, I know the pandemic, because we've slowed down so much we've stopped performing. I'm much more likely to live in the present, rather than always thinking about, oh gosh, in 5 days I need to be in Buenos Aires. Oh, and 2 months from now I'm in Bordeaux, and da da da. And it's been a great comfort for me to just say, you're here in Toronto. Tomorrow you'll be in Toronto. Just focus on that, and, you know, see your friends and enjoy your life. You know, I while there have been a lot of negative aspects of the pandemic, I think for those people who are looking for them, there were a lot of silver linings to be taken from it too. Time with family, because none of us knows how long we have with our family members, the people who care most about us. And also, you know, I hope we'll all appreciate the importance of even the people who annoy us the most in our lives, that better that they're in our lives than not at all, really. You know, I think there is a lot of good to be taken from the situation.
You've been so incredibly generous with your time and so candid, so frank. I loved the stories you told us and how much you shared. So I want to thank you. It's been a pleasure, Brett.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for asking.
And I hope we'll be sharing the concert stage or the opera house at some point soon. Again,
We
when this is all over.
we will. It will happen. We have to believe that it will happen, and I look forward to it.
All right. Until very soon then. Thank you.
Bye.